Bart Ehrman is an interesting figure because he studied under Bruce Metzger, who is seen as a scholarly New Testament giant of the 20th century. Bart, unlike Bruce, though, became a non-Christian over time, which makes for a pretty weird situation in life because you've kind of made a career in studying the New Testament, but now you don't believe, so what are you supposed to do now, kind of a thing? Well, how about make a career on debunking the Christians? Yes! So, having a insider view into the knowledge of the New Testament, especially knowledge that most Christians, as well as the general public, has no clue about, this knowledge being called the scholarly discipline of textual criticism, he wrote books making points from this discipline, which made a unique view into his critiques on Christianity, as opposed to the more normal critiques which come from more philosophical arguments. What worked even better than the traditional atheist arguments was how unguarded and unready Christians were for this kind of argumentation. The discipline of textual criticism was, of course, way, way beyond what the layperson had ever been exposed to, and so his books went off like a bomb. Also, the Western culture, of course, loves anyone who pokes holes or destroys Christianity, so needless to say, he became pretty popular. However, in recent years, though, I feel like there's not as much excitement or fame around his newest books. I'm not really sure. That's just maybe my opinion, but I feel like his newer books are maybe just kind of the same stuff or what, so it doesn't get the publicity that he used to get for sure. But I could be wrong. Maybe it's just me who doesn't ever hear of him as much anymore, but maybe everyone else listening to this is like, I hear of Bart all the time. What are you talking about, crazy guy? So that could just be me. But he definitely used to be very popular. So that whole intro is just to explain kind of generally in a snapshot what Bart Ehrman does and kind of why he's well known in the atheist community or just the skeptical community. And that's kind of my brief take on him. And as we approach the Christmas season and then the upcoming Easter season, atheist evangelists become more and more fervent in their evangelism. In keeping with this tradition, Bart, along with Genetically Modified Skeptic, came out with the 4 misconceptions Christians spread. So let's take a look at these misconceptions and see if the arguments are really valid. I'm Nathan Collins, bringing you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. But before I begin, I would like to take a moment and thank all of you who support this effort on Patreon. Mike and I are very grateful for all our supporters. Thank you. All right, the first misconception brought up is that the apostles or eyewitnesses had something to do with the writing of the gospel books. Silly Christians.
So now on to Dr. Ehrman's take on 4 Christian misconceptions about the New Testament. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by eyewitnesses, possibly those apostles themselves.
Of course, that's been the traditional view for many, many centuries. The view came to be questioned in modern times after the Enlightenment, especially in the 19th century and then into more modern times. It's important to point out that the gospel writers never named themselves. The phrase according to Matthew or according to Mark can be found in titles of the book. But nobody writes a book, calls their book, according to themselves. And when I'm writing a book now on the book of Revelation, and the title of the book will not be according to Bart. That's not the title of a book about Revelation. And so this is whoever put the title on there was telling you who, in their opinion, wrote the book. The books don't claim to be by eyewitnesses. They do not narrate their accounts in the first person. The third person is about Jesus and his disciples were doing. The authors never identify themselves as one of the disciples. They're anonymous, written in the third person. The authors are all writing in Greek, fairly good Greek, not as good as like the highest level of the elites of the empire, but pretty good Greek, better than 99.9% of the population could write, which means these people were highly educated Greek-speaking Christians living outside of Palestine. Jesus' followers were all Jews living in Palestine who spoke Aramaic, and we have no indication that any of his close followers were educated. The two of his closest followers, Peter and John, are explicitly said to be illiterate in the New Testament. Acts chapter 4, verse 13 says that they're agrammatoi, which means they don't know their letters. They don't know the alphabet. And so it's highly unlikely they're written by eyewitnesses. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They're written 30 to 60 years later by other people who had heard stories about Jesus in circulation that had been translated into Greek that they then wrote down and composed into Gospels. But I would say there's nothing to suggest that they were actually eyewitnesses, and they certainly don't claim to be.
I'm always kind of confused when someone is supposed to debunk something and then they leave it vague enough where they basically didn't debunk anything. That's kind of how this first one went for me. First misconception was brought up that the apostles or eyewitnesses didn't write the gospel books. Bart's ending rebuttal against this is that in Bart's opinion, it's highly unlikely they were written by eyewitnesses. The books don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, which actually, according to Bart, means they didn't write their names down on it. So therefore, they didn't intend for people to know it was from them. There's nothing to suggest they were written by eyewitnesses, and they never claimed to be written by eyewitnesses. Well, those are all nice opinions, Bart, but how does that even support the supposed misconception? The misconception was supposed to be that no apostles or eyewitnesses were involved in the writing of the gospel books. Supporting this with "they didn't claim to" doesn't have anything to do with proof concerning whether they did or didn't have anything to do with the writing of the books. This is a common tactic I have always noticed Bart use in debates on these kinds of issues. He doesn't actually address the issues at hand, but brings up problems that are close to the issues, but not actually the issue being discussed. And if you're not paying attention, you get sucked into the discussion and the points he wants to make versus the original point that was to be addressed. The real truth on this topic, plain and simple, is that we're talking about an issue that is 2,000 years ago. Either side of the argument doesn't have, in the end, ultimately a satisfactory amount of evidence to support its case conclusively. But what do you really expect? How realistic or reasonable is that? It was 2,000 years ago. We barely have thorough information on anything that we could be 100% certain from the time of antiquity. Now, if the question is that we were to make a choice based on the information we do have and put it on the scales to weigh the evidence out, without prejudice, of course, against Christianity, but just looked at it as impartially as we could, we would conclude that eyewitnesses and apostles were involved in the composition of the gospel books. There is a surprising amount of evidence for this belief, but hardly any evidence exists to doubt this. Again, that doesn't mean all the evidence conclusively proves this, but if we're making a decision based on the evidence that does exist, there isn't much that proves this supposed misconception argument they have laid out. Christians have plenty reason for thinking this. For instance, let's look at the Gospel of Luke. All right, so it kind of makes sense to look at the Gospels, as evidence and kind of see what's going on there. Do the Gospels have anything to say? Is Bart just completely right? And they never have anything to say about eyewitnesses or claim anything. So let's look at the Gospel of Luke. It reads, inasmuch, and this is at the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke, it reads, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Eyewitnesses delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So there are things that people have been taught, and Luke is going to compile the narratives that have been given to them from the beginning by eyewitnesses, so that Theophilus can be certain about what he has been taught. So it's pretty apparent in the Gospel of Luke, at least, that the Gospel is assuming that this information has been gathered from eyewitnesses. That's what the writer is telling us. The writer of the Gospel of Luke is telling us that this information has been gathered from eyewitnesses. Now you can say, well, that gospel's lying. They didn't really get their information from eyewitnesses. But the question was, why do Christians claim this? That this is some misconception that the Christians believe about their own books. Well, the reason they believe this is because the book literally says that's where they got their information from. The book of Luke is a gospel book and says literally in the very beginning that they got the information from eyewitnesses, at least the people being talked about by Luke here. Let's look at some other evidence. Eusebius's church history. Eusebius is a Christian, and in his history of the church, he tells who they believed wrote and was involved with the Gospels. And who would have thunk it? They believed eyewitnesses and apostles were involved in the writing of the Gospels. Need some more evidence? You also have Justin Martyr's writings, which go back to the 2nd century, as well as Irenaeus and others also believed the apostles had to do with writing these Gospels, and that there were 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, just like we have today. There's also Papias, a very early church father who makes claims as to the eyewitnesses and apostles behind the Gospels. Papias lived from 60 to 130 AD. This is a general estimate, of course, but not by much. The writings we have of him are dated to have been written around 90 to 110 AD. This is impressive because the Gospels are estimated to have been written somewhere between 60 to 90 AD, John being generally seen as the last of the 4. So Papias writing his work around the turn of the 2nd century is hardly much time after especially the Gospel of John being written. We're talking very early in Christian history. This is basically the 2nd generation of Christians, the first generation being the apostles themselves and those who were a part of the very beginning church. So these guys might know a little something about who wrote what. Papias is described as an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp. by Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus in 180 AD. So he may know a little bit about what was involved in the composition of the Gospels. All right, so for some more evidence about the early authenticity of the belief of early eyewitnesses or the apostles having to do with the Gospels, goes back to the manuscripts themselves. If you go to CSNTM, which is a pretty famous resource website, what they've been doing is going through the world and digitizing all the manuscripts of the New Testament. And they have these really high in-depth cameras, and you can get super close to the manuscript, and it's just pretty amazing. What you can do now with technology and everything, pretty crazy. But why I'm going here is in these early manuscripts, now you'll see the date 2nd to 3rd century. So we're talking really early. I mean, this is some of the earliest manuscripts we have, and you will see the titles of the Gospels written on them, okay? And this is on many of them, all right? This one's from the 3rd century, the Gospel according to John, right there is the title. So this is something that has been believed by Christians for a very long time. So the idea that it's just like, Christians have just misrepresented this or have this misconception about who wrote these Gospels, it goes back to the earliest documents we have of the Gospels themselves. It's literally written right there as the title. So this is why Christians have believed this for a very, very long time. I mean, we're talking the 2nd and 3rd centuries at least. This was written as a title to it. Now, of course, the original probably did not have the Gospel according to John written on it. But this going back so early obviously shows this is what everyone believed. So to doubt it seems kind of odd. I mean, where's the evidence that shows that this is not what really happened, that this is not from John? You have to have actual evidence. And as far as the evidence goes, the manuscripts all say according to, and then they say the author. So I'm not really sure if you're to go against that, where you're going to get that information. So, unlike Bart, I've given you a lot of evidence real quick here to support why Christians believe this. So, what do skeptics say to this, right? I've just given you a bunch of information. Well, what skeptics often say in response to really any evidence given is that, well, those guys are all wrong, though. Can't trust it. Nope. Not good enough sources for me. So, really, no matter how much evidence I bring, it doesn't really matter. They're going to say, liar, or they're from ancient sources, so therefore they're wrong because people from the past didn't know anything. Unlike people 2,000 years after the fact who clearly know what happened. Which, of course, makes no sense whatsoever, and shows a greater problem of bias and prejudice against people from the past that is so seemingly prevalent in our time, and this really, if you can't tell, irks me. The arrogance is kind of unbelievable. What makes this even more ridiculous is when you have a claim that something is wrong or untrue, you're supposed to bring evidence to support such a claim. What evidence or document says that this is an untrue belief with the 4 Gospels? Speaking from silence doesn't prove anything, and giving opinions or playing the what-if game isn't evidence. As William Lane said, an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. All right, so kind of coming to a close here, kind of running out of time. We'll probably split this up into a couple parts, but besides that, if you are interested in learning more about the information covered here, I have some resources that I have used in addressing these topics. One is Eusebius's History of the Church. It's a good one. The other book is The Question of Canon by Dr. Michael Kruger. It's a really good book. Definitely should read it. If you want to go look at the manuscripts, the website is CSNTM. And good Bible software. If you're looking for a good Bible software to use, I would suggest Accordance Bible software. It's pretty awesome. It's amazing, really, the technology and the tools that they have these days to like quickly sift through tons and tons of information really quickly. It's pretty amazing. So those are the different resources I use for this episode, in case you're wondering. Well, that's all for this episode. I'd like to say thank you to my Patreon supporters. We are blessed to have you, and you keep the lights on here. Thank you. If you're new to this channel and you like this episode, go ahead and subscribe and visit our page on Facebook and check out our other episodes as we address different issues in our world and bring you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. Grace and peace, brothers and sisters.